Hi, everyone. My name is Stacy Cervenka. I live in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I'm here tonight with three other blind ladies who work in the fields of mental health, domestic violence, and community organizing and justice. As many of you know, in the blind community, a lot of us have been talking about various types of abuse that are prevalent within the blind community. And for many of us, that has brought up a lot of feelings of re-traumatization, things that we may have not thought of before, feelings we may not have had in a long time, whether that's anger or shame. And so we just wanted to sit together tonight and talk about how we can move forward with healing and how we can move forward as a community and build systems that ensure that these types of incidences are prevented in the future. And then when they do happen, that survivors do get justice. So I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves. Maida, why don't you go first?
Sure. So my name is Maida Avdic. I am a provisionally licensed mental health provider in the state of Nebraska. I also live in Nebraska like Stacy. I am also a certified master level social worker. So I do have some background and training in mental health as well as disability advocacy and disability rights. And I also am a blind a blind person myself who has been involved in various blindness communities.
Excellent, thank you. Jennith?
Hi, yes, thank you, Stacy. My name is Jennith. I am a second-year master's student in marriage and family therapy, so we're working toward being a fully licensed marriage and family therapist. Currently working as a therapist. I also work supporting disabled students in a university setting through student support services. I am also a part of the blind community, as well as a survivor of sexual violence in various degrees and ways. I'm really happy to be here.
Awesome. Shafeka?
Hey everybody, my name is Shafeka Hashash. I'm the Economic Justice Programs Manager at the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So in this role professionally, I work with 55 or so domestic violence programs across the state of Georgia, helping them with economic justice, which includes everything from housing access to like financial stability to sexual harassment in the workplace. And of course, having been doing domestic violence work for a while, I had a background doing this at an immigration and refugee resettlement agency. I've been working kind of in the fields of family violence and not even just sexual assault, but just general, the anti-violence movement now for 4 or so years. And I too am blind and have been super involved in a lot of actually different disability work, blindness, as well as kind of umbrella disability work, fighting for justice and equality. I am not a mental health specialist, but I'm a community organizer and activist and have been kind of absolutely a trainer in advocacy around anti-violence in multiple different types of communities now for a few years.
Well, thank you all so much for being with us tonight. As some of you may know, I put out a post on Facebook a few days ago asking for people who are blind or low vision who had experienced either sexual or psychological or emotional abuse at blind community events or within blind community, blindness rehabilitation centers or conferences or conventions or summer camps or schools to share those stories with me. And I honestly thought I would probably get about 5 to 7 people to open up, and I got over 50. And I noticed that there were a lot of recurring themes in the stories. And one of the themes that I saw a lot were especially younger people who might be the only blind or low vision person at their high school or at their college. And they might be the only blind person they've ever met. And often they may not have been considered a sexual being or, dateable by, other kids at their high school. And then finally they go to a summer camp or a summer, program or some sort of conference or convention. And now all of a sudden they're around people who do think of them that way. Do you think that how do you think that influences the prevalence of, I guess, abuse and the grooming and abuse of people who are blind and low vision?
So I would say, again, this is Maida, and I would say that this is a very common phenomenon for a lot of reasons. The idea that the loneliness that comes with being the only person as a young person, or even older, certainly throughout the lifespan, of being the only person with whatever type of disability, in this case blindness and low vision, the loneliness and isolation of that, being the only person within your general community that experiences or that lives with that type of disability, and how that impacts your life, not having people that relate to you, as well as being seen as less of a human with your own autonomy and your own ability to dictate your body, like that it belongs to you, and also that being seen as less of a sexual being definitely impacts your ability to learn how to say no and have autonomy over your body. And it does make it more likely that people will struggle with self-confidence and will feel that they are desirable. Those are all things that are nothing that the person individually has done wrong. It is more of a systemic issue in how society treats people with disabilities. And that unfortunately tends to happen across the board. I've done some research on disability and self-esteem in various settings, whether it's education, employment, etc. And this tends to happen across the board in multiple settings. And unfortunately, that is part of only one of many factors that can lead to increased incidence of abuse for people with disabilities.
And now what about, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to add to that too, right? Like understanding that coming into centers or like these, like wherever these places are, right? Like in community of blindness. And so like no longer feeling isolated, and also maybe experiencing being treated differently, or like how that transition happens. I think that, right, like it's on both sides where like there's both like there's grooming and there are understandings of like very premeditated grooming in these situations. And there's also people who have never before, right, seen themselves as sexual as well in the same way, right? And so there's a need there's no accountability from people who then commit acts of sexual violence in these settings. And so it's like both that, like folks come in particularly vulnerable ways, and then people who then commit acts of sexual violence, like there's no accountability or even sometimes the understanding like how all of this is working. And so together these things create like a really toxic environment, which happens a lot in institutional settings of various levels.
Really quick,
and I also think
it's quickly define grooming. I know that you use the term grooming. Can someone just quickly define that?
Yes, that was literally what I was about to say, Stacy.
Awesome.
Thank you. I think it's important for us to make sure that we're clear on our terminology. So grooming just basically means the process of psychologically and mentally putting somebody into a position where they feel that where they're in a position where they can be abused. So for instance, if an abuser grooms somebody, that means that they spend a lot of time making them feel special, making them feel wanted. It also might mean that they are making them feel that they don't have power or autonomy over their bodies and over the decisions that they make. It's essentially just creating the circumstances and manipulating somebody so that they are going to be in a position where it's going to be easier to abuse them in any type of way, whether that's sexual or emotional, verbal abuse, etc.
So possibly like alienating them from their friends or their family and that type of stuff.
Yeah, grooming can look there's a lot of different ways people will do it. It can look very different depending on the situation, the perpetrator and the victim.
I really want to hone in on Jennith's point, though, that I think was like truly excellent, which is that there is super intentional grooming, right? So let's say it's people in different power positions, like teacher and student, or advisor and mentee. But there's also not, and there's also with kids across the same age ranges. Both people are in their 20s or are teenagers or whatever it is. And that is less so often grooming and more so something that we also need to think of as a systemic issue, not just where there have been factors where the survivor is, being put into these really crummy situations, but also I think something that the anti-violence movement is really trying to start talking a lot more about is also thinking that there also needs to be work done on the other side. So you have these groups, and this isn't to say that it's always men or whatever, but you have these Men Stopping Violence groups, which actually address these factors. And so, it is to also say, and I think I could be totally wrong if this is not what you were getting at, Jennith, but for both sets of people, often when they're the same age, it is the first time they're kind of dealing with the same types of situations, right? Having been isolated or whatever. And so these violences are occurring and they have totally different dynamics than the ones where someone is completely abusing their power over somebody else. And so, that's another thing to think about, because it's still part of the exact same problem where disabled people are super infantilized. Like in TV, they just always need help and are inspiring. And you don't have autonomy over your body, even when someone's trying to, force you to take their help to cross the street, much less than to be, thought of having bodily autonomy in like a sexual situation. And so a lot of that really does play across the board. And I think that's what leads to not only violence, but also the committing of that violence too.
Yeah.
No.
And sorry,
Go ahead. No,
I just wanted to add to that too, right? Like that it's, it doesn't make the violence any less, right? It doesn't make the impact of the violence any less. But how we approach it, like how we conceptualize it, has to be in line with who is committing the violence, and also like understanding that the lack of accountability that allows for grooming is the same lack of accountability that allows for all the other kinds of violences that happen that aren't grooming, right? That aren't that same kind of level of like premeditation.
So what I think I understand you saying, and again, I don't have a mental health background necessarily to an extent, is that, being blind in society, we receive microaggressions every day. And so we're kind of experiencing constant little traumas, and over an entire life, that can really add up to a significant amount of trauma. And so even those who perpetuate the abuse and who perpetrate the abuse, often that comes out of a place of trauma. I mean, they've experienced ableism, they've experienced stigma, they're likely marginalized as well. That doesn't make it okay, but it kind of adds to the,
that's a layer in how we want to approach the solutions later.
Right. So it's not an excuse, but it's in order to understand and fix the problem, we do have to understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a saying that we have within, I'm sure lots of disciplines have this, but I've heard it a lot in the social work field, that hurt people hurt people. Yeah. And so essentially, like exactly what you're saying, Stacy, that this didn't come out of nowhere. There's a lot of factors that contributed to what might have led an abuser to abuse. And part of that is microaggressions and their own trauma. And it is super important to be able to understand that, but also I think sometimes we can step in. The people who experience abuse there's a kind of a fine line between understanding it, and then they'll use it to justify, or they'll tell themselves, to justify the behavior, like, oh, he's just really doesn't understand. He hasn't had a lot of social outlets, etc., trying to justify it to themselves. But the reality is, understanding it as a way to approach doesn't mean that the victims and the survivors have to, that's an acceptable reason to that it still should have never happened to them, and it's still not okay. It just helps us to be able to get a better grasp of what may have contributed to this happening and how we can work on addressing it.
Excellent. So you can recognize that people have experienced or perpetrators have experienced their own trauma, but they still shouldn't be perpetrating that against others.
Absolutely.
Another theme that I've noticed is kind of the theme that people are very concerned about coming forward, whether it's, to authorities, to leadership, coming out with it publicly, is that they fear that they're going to lose their community. They often, people who are blind because of ableism, because of stigma, can be rather marginalized, at least to an extent. And so often the blind community is, people really think of it as their family, and that word gets used, family. And so if you come out against someone who's a loved member of that family, and that family is really tight, like, you worry about losing your community, and not only your community, like your friendships, but services, advocacy. So could you guys talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and so that's a really important dynamic that we see in violence, period, right? Is that not only is this community aspect there, which, like, to help people put it into context, it's not just disabled community, right? It would be, if it's cultural, it would be in family settings, it would be in, even if it's like a hobby, things of that nature. When we see people like whose friends, husbands or boyfriends committed abuse against them, it's, well, am I about to lose my best friend of 10 years or my whole social circle, etc. Much less than when it's something like a blindness community, which you finally have that you feel included in. But it's also these factors around, like that power dynamic of getting your services withheld, especially if we're talking about at a training center, getting retaliated against,
Getting kicked out,
losing your scholarship, getting blacklisted in that organization, that you won't be asked to do anything anymore, for them and whatnot. And those are legitimate, like, violence tactics that end up happening. And so, that's one of the largest things. And we have to make a reckoning of, people did come forward, and they did stop getting asked to do X, Y, and Z. And whether that's, I often believe that kind of thing is very intentional. But even when it's unintentional, because now, they stopped being asked for a year or two, so therefore they've kind of just fallen off the radar completely. And they've been forced out of this community. And like this blacklist kind of idea is super prevalent. And it's not just a fear that people have, but it's something that happens. If we look at the Me Too movement, it's renowned actresses who are like, I could have lost everything and never had another job a day in my life. And so that's exactly what happens likewise in the blindness community.
And I will say, there are many instances across the stories that people have sent me. There certainly are stories of, I wanted to report the behavior of this person, but someone else had reported it previously and something negative happened to them. Whether it was they got kicked out of a training center, they got services withdrawn, they got, blacklisted by a group or whatever. So, that is something that you see a lot of, that I wanted to come forward, but I saw what happened to so-and-so. Or
they get the troublemaker label, which is something we see a lot.
Is anybody here not a troublemaker? Are we all troublemakers?
But that Stacy always starting drama. That, so-and-so, especially if it fits a nice stereotype we have about someone's race or their background or, whatever it is. And especially when it's women, and women are like hysterical and dramatic and X, Y, and Z. And so you get the troublemaker background, that this person is always just stirring things up, and X, Y, and Z, or is, the same tropes we're going to see elsewhere. But at this point, it means that your rehab services get worse. And like we were talking about, like things that you rely on for funding or whatever it is, that gets cut. and you lose this really important community where you actually feel belonging.
And I've also, besides services, I've heard advocacy as well, such as, you know, I am concerned about coming out against an organization that does advocacy or activism because what if I should need it one day?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think too, right, along with that idea is like this, like the protection, right, the community does, right? I mean, I guess I'm thinking of it, right, as a systemic therapist, a marriage and family therapist, we think of like, right, first like the family, but then bigger than the family, right, are all kinds of systems, right? And like all
Mm-hmm.
these systems are working to protect themselves. What they want is for everything to remain the same. And so all these different levels of protection go out to keep things exactly the same so that nothing changes, right? And then also I'm thinking through like how, so those responses come in as protections of the system as it is, right? And the ways in which that then affects people. And then, you know, it's also like, right, like our relationship with the community is also about like what the community has given to us. So that fear of like being isolated from the community. But, you know, I've talked with people who are like, but this community has done so much for me. How could I say something against it, right? And so it's like also like these feelings of responsibility, like that are like internal to like protect the community because it has helped you in some way. It has supported you in some way.
And I think going off of that, Jennith, what's really sad that we haven't made this more clear in all areas of society where abuse happens, which is everywhere, but especially within these disability communities, I think what we need to make sure from a healing standpoint that we make clear is that it is actually when a person says something and comes forward and is courageous enough to do that, it is actually their desire to make this community better. It is because most of the time, for most people, it is because they believe in it and they love it that much and they don't want to see the same thing happen to themselves again, or even more to anybody else. So I think that when we recognize that rather than telling somebody, a survivor, that they're being a troublemaker or they're making things worse or bashing on a community that helped them so much, the reality is most of the time the survivors that I've talked to, it's because they want to make their communities better and they don't want this to be swept under the rug for the next person. So it's really important from a healing standpoint to recognize that the gaslighting that happens where people are told that they're being ungrateful or they're going to make things worse, that actually it's a lot of the times it's the opposite. Most survivors are trying to do it to help the community improve and not see this terrible violence happen to others around them.
Well, and you love the community so much that you know it's better than this, and you know that the community, the good things that it has done for you.
Exactly. And
it's funny because that fire, for some reason, that fire metaphor comes up a lot, that, people are starting fires. And in a way, when I hear that, I think, yeah, but they're not trying to burn something down. It's more of a purifying fire, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So now I guess I wanted to talk about what barriers do you guys think that blind and low vision people face to pursuing justice and to pursuing healing? I know that's a lot, so talk amongst yourselves.
So I would say on an individual level, it is some of these concerns that we just mentioned, the fact that you feel that you are going to be ostracized, or a survivor will feel that they will be ostracized. That is a big barrier that makes it harder, just on an internal individual level, that makes it harder to come forward. Not feeling like you won't be believed, that's a common one. And unfortunately, as others have mentioned before, I think when you see that happen to other people, that just reiterates that your fear to come forward because you saw somebody else have a bad outcome. But that's why it is so critical and important to have this kind of support and to have others who, even individuals who haven't experienced this, like I'm not a victim of any kind of severe abuse or sexual violence in this context, but having an ally such as all of us standing here talking about it and being upfront and showing open support, that's why it's so critical to have that on an individual level, because there are so many reasons why a person will have this internal dialogue with themselves of reasons why they're afraid to come forward, but having that backup and support is critical. And then especially if we do see it kind of spread to and on a larger scale throughout an organization or a subculture, or even like the main culture, like the Me Too movement and Time's Up movement. When we see that happening on the larger scale that it happens on, the more it's going to help victims and survivors feel supported to come forward.
So Jennith and Shafeka, what barriers do you have anything to add as far as barriers that blind and low vision people might experience, either to pursuing justice, whether that's reporting it to law enforcement, the authorities, certifying bodies, whatever, counselors, and also pursuing healing?
Yeah. So, blind and low vision folks, just to really make sure this is out there, are going to face every barrier that everyone else is facing. And so I want to name that, the sexism, all the terrible things, the victim blaming is going to happen. But I think some of the really unique things that happen are a couple, right? So one is then not being able to actually have another source to talk to this with, because you go to, it's hard enough for survivors to talk to their families or their other friends about these things, but much less your family, who will then, just be devastated because, especially with disabled kids, they finally had an ounce of independence and this is what happened. Or you go to a therapist or someone who's really kind of disability, let's just name it, right? Disability inept and disability unaware, who is just, oh my God, this happened to you because you're blind, and they exploited you because you're blind, and isn't really seeing that full picture. And so in addition to losing your actual disability community of support, you actually have very few, if any, other places where you feel like you can be understood in what you're going through. And then the last thing I really want to name is, in going forward to, let's say, authorities, or kind of explaining it just to other people in general, so many disabled people, myself included, are kind of have these ridiculous stories of being high schoolers or college students or whatever, and someone is showing an ounce of attention, and I'm not even talking about sexual, you're just friends with another person, and that person's like, oh, you should feel so lucky, oh, they like you, da da da. And it's just even if there's nothing actually going on. And so it's just that then you're compounding it with the fact of you should feel happy that someone liked you, you should feel happy that someone wanted to be with you.
He's such a nice guy.
Well, especially if we're going to include the dynamic of it being a sighted person at a blindness, place. And in that the pinnacle, a sighted person being interested, and when we're talking about again, rehab agencies, training centers, conventions, if it's the sibling of another blind person, the parent, the spouse, who the heck knows. And so those are kind of the things that compound to the already existing factors that happen for anyone who comes forward.
Yeah, and I think you really already said this, Shafeka, but right, there's not a lot of justice in the criminal justice system for survivors, right? And so for anybody, but then that gets compounded with ableism and sexism and all these other things happening. So reporting or things like this aren't always really something that will give you justice, right? No matter who you are. And then I just also, again, highlighting going through these routes that are supposed to be healing, and they can be re-traumatizing, re-triggering, including therapists who can be really harmful, right? Working with clients who have been harmed because of therapists who did not have a social model of disability or any kind, that did not, right, repeat the same kinds of things that harmed them already.
Mhm.
Right, so you go to this place for support, and what you're met with is like being really demeaned or feeling like, let's just say it, right? Feeling really crummy about yourself because you went to and I completely agree, Jennith, and we'll totally get into that. And like the healing portion's more of like reporting honest for many people doesn't bring justice, but you go to a place and they're, talking to you like a baby, and they're being, patronizing, and they're being the way that society generally is towards people with disabilities, while you're trying to recount, a violent experience and like, or a sexual experience, or, whatever it is. And it's completely just compounded with all these other crummy things that come around with ableism, whether it's from your traditional institutions or from your disability institutions, and then being ostracized there.
I also wanted to add a couple more barriers that do come up. So I'm thinking about people who come into training with a lower level of skills, especially in regards to accessing information. Coming into training as far as blindness training, or whether even if you're not in training, you go to a convention or anywhere else, somebody who has less alternative skills to be able to access information using a screen reader or Braille or whatever methods needed to maybe look up, where do I report if it's something that I want to report, let's say, to an external authorities that are not within the organization or within this institution. Even accessing information to figure out where to report might be hard, depending on like if somebody just lost their sight and they are really struggling to use, some of the basic tools that we've learned, that can be hard. And then also economic inequities that make it harder to be able to not only be able to report effectively and get help and support, but also even just to be able to survive whatever, if there are negative ramifications. So for example, I know I had friends in the past who, when they went to training, they were between homes. They were houseless at the time. And so, no, okay. And so then being able to, if they get kicked out of training, we know, I've done some research on disability and employment, and obviously we know the high unemployment rates for all disabilities, particularly blindness. So if we know that a person is not able, doesn't have as much economic standing, they're going to struggle to be able to deal if they get kicked out of training and now they don't have a home to go to. So just the economics of it as well is another barrier for sure.
And I really want to take just a second to define training, just in case anybody's watching this from the cross disability community or a parent or someone else. Training, when we talk about training in the blindness community, often we're talking about a blindness rehabilitation, meaning when you just lose your sight, or perhaps you haven't had great, great training when you were growing up, learning how to use a long white cane to get around, or learning how to use a guide dog to cross streets and, navigate grocery stores, learning how to read Braille, learning how to use adaptive technology, whether it's computers or smartphones or technology to help with your house, and then independent living skills such as cooking, cleaning, home management. So when we talk about training, we're often talking about a blindness rehabilitation center where blind people can go for a certain period of time to get these skills so that hopefully they can, live independently in their communities and get jobs and all the things. And I, that's an extremely important point, that when a lot of times these are residential centers, and often when people live at those centers, that's their home for that period of time, whether it's 6 weeks or a year, like that training center is their home. And if they get kicked out, they have nowhere else to go. And that's a very vulnerable position,
right?
Very vulnerable. I guess so then talking then about, so what, how can people who are blind and low vision, let's say they're going through, their experiences have been dredged up again, they're having difficult feelings or difficult thoughts. How can people kind of begin on the road to healing?
So that's a big question, right? Because it kind of comes into how can people be on their own individual roads to healing, into how can we make sure that the systems and organizations we're a part of actually support and facilitate places of healing. Because right now what they do actively do and they do actively advocate for is being a place of healing from having grown up and been, let's say, super sheltered, being a place of healing and empowerment, to being able to like find yourself and accomplish what you'd like to, instead of just this box that you had been shoved into your whole life or whatever it is. And so it's not as though our agencies and organizations don't actively want this. They actively want people to heal and be their full selves in embracing blindness, but aren't doing this when it comes to survivors and people being harmed within their own organizations. And so I think there are two ways to answer it. One is, the kind of individual way of what can someone do right now. And of course, some of those great answers, great things would be like support groups, knowing that they're not alone for one, seeking therapy and counseling. I'm kind of the mind that literally every single person in the world should be in counseling.
Agreed.
But I'm not biased at all. Yeah.
But, and then kind of finding what's working with them, whether it's like cognitive behavioral therapy, all these different things that are on their individual roadmap. But I think in terms of a big picture, what we can make sure we're doing and the organizations we're a part of, if they're actually serious in this and in being part of the solution, is actually creating a process that is promoting survivor healing. And I think, something really interesting that Stacy and I had named was that a lot of these places where you like report abuse and whatnot, they actually just end up feeling like tribunals of, are you lying? Yes or no?
I love that you said that. That was so great.
Yeah, I mean, I call them like the DV for domestic violence, but same thing like sexual assault, whatever it is, these harassment tribunals, instead of places where you're actually going and they're saying, okay, like we need to, think about this roadmap. And so for me, a lot of that comes into these discussions of transformative justice. And so Jennith, I loved earlier, had mentioned that most people don't actually find solace in reporting, especially when that reporting ends up being re-traumatizing. They get blacklisted and it leads to nothing. In fact, they regret reporting. But when reporting leads to positive outcomes, that's when people actually often start their own healing journey. And so what that could look like is, first of all, not making these processes feel like a tribunal, and that they're, you should be scared and afraid to come forward and, oh, I hope you know every detail back and forth perfectly. You also really shouldn't have to be sharing your story more than once. If these processes are put in place properly, the biggest thing we can do, like to harm survivors, is to make them keep sharing that story 1,000 times over. And we see it, period, not just in blindness community. I went to the police department, then I talked to the judge, then I went to the medical offices because it was, sexual assault or whatever it is. And that it's within 2 weeks, recounting that story 10 times. It's completely demoralizing. Like it totally destroys you. And so in terms of when we're talking about healing, it's putting in a real process in place that also holds this other person accountable and isn't just okay, Stacy, you messed up, you're kicked out for 6 months and you'll come back when that's over. That's not transformative. That doesn't restore anything. And it typically doesn't make anyone feel any better because that person just ends up coming back in 6 months. They got an early retirement.
Often it's private. No one else knows that when I come back, I haven't just been, on a sabbatical writing a novel. Yeah, exactly. Writing the great American novel in my
exactly. No, I mean precisely. And so if we're talking about a real process, it's where the person who kind of did the abusing has to reckon with what they have actually done. It's where, and this is, of course, if the survivor wants it. Not every survivor is going to say, I want transformative justice. We have been finding that survivors who go through these processes and who've gone through kind of other cultural norms of transformative justice that look very different, tend to be the ones who can be on their kind of healing journeys. You know, obviously better than ones who then got ostracized from their own communities and whatnot. But so, you know, it's putting these systems in place and doing so in a real way, like whether it's paying someone to actually be able to do this instead of expecting that it's just going to be done by like Joe Schmo, you know, state president, who suddenly is going to become a transformative justice expert.
He's a nice guy. I'm sure he'll do a great
precisely.
job.
And it's also showing people that you are taking this seriously, but not because you suddenly are the court of law and you are, you know, a judge and, you know, beyond a reasonable doubt. You're not a judge. Like, this isn't court. Like, what this actually is an organization that's saying that they are supporting their most, you know, marginalized members. And that's the stance it needs to be coming at. Whereas typically it comes at the stance of recreating these shitty systems that we've, you know, just spent the last 30, 40 minutes saying do harm. And it's just recreating them in the blindness community instead of saying, what can we do that's actually different and better? Because these systems don't address blind people. So why are we implementing them here?
And we do need to talk about later how we as a blind community can do better in this. And I love that you addressed it from a systemic place. Like, how can you find healing from a systemic perspective? How can people, you know, let's say you're waiting for that justice and we need that systemic perspective, but what about the person who's suffering tonight? What about this person who's suffering tomorrow? Like, what can they be doing?
So I want to like actually in some ways like answer that and also like build off, right? Or like, I guess like narrow down what transformative justice can look like or begin with, like on an individual level, right? Because first of all, none of us should have to do this alone, right? Like, no part of this should be like work that you have to do in isolation to heal yourself. Like, healing is not a journey that like you undertake as a single person. Like, we heal in community, we heal in relationship. And so, and like also I want to name, right, like a lot of like transformative justice work comes out of disability community, disability justice community. So like thinking about how, right, like the way disabled people have built community, like that's our wisdom, right? Like that comes from like our wisdom to like a place of like survivorship and wisdom. So I want to like name that. And like, so one of the like things that a disability justice and transformative justice advocate activist talks about, Mia Mingus, they talk about, right, like creating a pod. And what's a pod? Like a pod is like literally thinking about like the people around me who I feel can support me in this moment, right? So like, and it's like literally thinking really materially about like, what do I need? How can, you know, how can this person support me? How can I support this person? Like, what do I need in this moment? And how can these people around me, how can I get that support? And like understanding like, you don't have to do any of this alone. And we don't, like, nobody can heal alone, and you can, there are people around you who you can reach out to, and you can build that support network, or you can lean on and rely on that support network.
Maida, do you have any thoughts on
Yeah, I definitely like the idea of building that pod. I think it can be really hard, particularly, I'm going to speak specifically in training because I just remember that experience well when I first got there. Luckily, eventually I was able to make good friends, but I do remember that isn't, first of all, I recognize that is not true for everybody. And I also know that I do remember initially when I first started, before I made these great friends, it was a very lonely experience. And I've unfortunately heard that just a lot of people say that it was hard to find people that they could really connect with in such a stressful, life-altering experience. So I recognize that it can be hard in the moment when things are happening to build that pod, especially, you know, in the immediate aftermath of the trauma. You're thinking, what do I do? But if we're speaking in this moment right now, I think we've all learned through COVID that we can find very creative ways to connect with people, that even if they're not physically right in front of you. So just to expand on what Jennith said, I think using all of our resources is helpful. So even if it's not people that are directly right there physically, maybe I do join an online support group. Maybe I do reach out to a social media platform that I really like, or friends at home. Maybe if I'm in training right now, I reach out to friends at home that I think I could connect with better. But just finding that pod. And I also think there's a lot of mental health. I know mental health access is always a struggle. It has been for a very long time, unfortunately, and it's something that we in this field continue to work on increasing access. But I would say that there's a lot of mental health therapists who offer sliding scale fees. And now, again, with COVID, they've become much more flexible in allowing people to see people remotely via telehealth. So finding a mental health provider has gotten, I don't want to say it's gotten easier, but it's gotten more accessible, and it's become easier to see them remotely in situations where you're not physically there, or you don't feel comfortable because of COVID or anything else, or maybe you don't have access to a car to get to your appointment. So finding a provider, if you're comfortable with doing that, it can be very, very helpful. It's just sometimes it takes a while to find the right person, but sometimes you get lucky and the first person you meet, you feel like they're going to be helpful to you, and you can build that relationship as another source of healing support.
I would be super remiss, not to mention, obviously, especially nationally, when people are feeling like, holy moly, I don't know that I'm in the headspace right now to do any ounce of research or anything. But just that there is always the National Domestic Violence Hotline, the National Sexual Assault Hotline, which are really good, completely confidential. You can talk to someone or you can just text chat. And in a lot of states, so in Georgia, we specifically have a teen dating violence text line. And that's been super popular because it's not someone who's you're a teenager, you're not actually able to find things through your insurance by yourself. I mean, hell, when did the rest of us learn how to go through our insurance cards and see what we have, much less know what it is when you're 16, 17 in a summer program. But teen dating text lines have been super helpful in covering some of those gaps too.
No, that's really interesting that you say that, because one thing that I strongly believe is I actually think every blindness agency, and this may be controversial, but every blindness agency should have a counselor on staff.
I couldn't agree more.
And 100%.
And I think about my husband used to work at an agency called Society for the Blind, and they now have a counselor on staff, a full-time counselor that any blind person in the community can make an appointment with. You don't have to be receiving a service there. If you are blind, you can get help. And I think because there are so many barriers to blind people getting help, whether it's financial, it's completely free. And as blind people, beyond abuse, we experience microaggressions all day, every day. And so, I think as blindness agencies, that's a big thing that we need to be doing.
I could have literally another hour-long spiel about that, which I'll spare you to do that. But I will say I did my first internship, my social work, at a blindness agency that also had a therapist, and it was phenomenal. The mental health services, it doesn't even matter if I agreed with every single piece of how they did all of the training. That's not even relevant. The fact that they had mental health providers there really made a huge difference and really made me appreciate that agency a lot, because it was so helpful to the people who were going through training at the time to have that as a service. And everybody had, to begin their training, everybody had a therapist on counseling on their schedule, and then eventually they kind of played it by ear to see how the person did and if they needed more, and then they decided later on if they were going to keep using a counselor. But it was
that is amazing. That is so cool. That is so cool. And that way, the nice thing about that is people don't have to ask. So if they feel a stigma, even if the center itself doesn't have a stigma, if I come from a background where for some reason, seeking mental health help is looked down upon, if I, if it's part of my day, hey, I just automatically,
it's an automatic on their schedule.
Then, I don't have to feel awkward.
Right. Exactly. Yep. I saw big, burly, old 70-year-old men, and they'd go to therapy and they loved it. So I think it was really great. Absolutely.
And just kind of on the notion again of the because I know we're going to bounce into the what should agencies be doing and everything. But in the individual healing, I also really want to emphasize, so again, like, I believe everyone and their dog should be in therapy, but, forms of healing are really culturally specific. And if I told, other folks to go to therapy in my own background, they wouldn't just say no because of stigma, but they also have more legitimate reasons where it's, well, why would I go to therapy when we do these practices instead? And I find that to be really healing. And for some, that's, dance. For some, that's getting a group of people together, and you don't call it therapy, and you have 5 people and you sit in an auntie's living room and everyone, commiserates together about the things that are happening.
Yes.
We don't traditionally, in the American context, see that as therapy. It's really goddamn therapeutic for people.
It is, yeah.
And so it doesn't also have to look in this kind of way that we think it does. And this is something we really talk about a lot, again, in the anti-violence movement, is not everything needs to be professional. You are actually able to do things yourself, and it doesn't have to be perfect with a model written out and a perfect facilitator. And it doesn't have to look the way things, tend to look in the United States. Like, there's excellent resources and things to read and share about what therapeutic practices look like in other countries that have nothing to do with sitting and talking to someone one-on-one, but are effectively doing that same type of thing. But if it's healing circles with groups of people, if it's towns coming together to have group discussions, if it's trusted community members, and I say all this to, like, not to discount that, of course, in any practice, therapy included, you could have abusive people in them. But that, like, if for you, what's actually really helpful is even talking to someone else in your cultural community, in your religious community. If it's, like I said, like sitting with 6 other, like, women or whatever it is in an auntie's living room and just commiserating, then that's fine too. And that none of this is like prescriptive, and it's all very much just based on the individual.
Absolutely.
You guys, real quick, so we have a baby girl visitor, my daughter Josephine, who's 3, came to sit in my lap. So I'm going to ask her, Josephine, can you go find Daddy? And help. She got out of bed. Do you want to go find Daddy? No, you don't want to find Daddy. Okay, we're just going to, Leo. Okay, now the whole gang's all here. Okay, honey, can you take your baby sister, please, and go to bed? Thank you. Okay, go with big brother. Go with brother. Mommy's talking to her friends. Okay, can you guys please go to bed? I know, honey. Mommy's going to come and say goodnight to you in a little bit, okay? Yes, she can stay. Please go to bed, Leo. Okay. You guys, I'm so sorry. Hey, Greg, I have 2 youthful visitors. Can you,
I got 20. I'll go through
Yeah.
this one and see if they were in bed. Hey.
You're getting real life here, everyone. Okay.
Sorry, I was a lot of
Yeah, babe. Okay.
Sorry, I forgot.
Okay. So, as we were, where were we? I'm sorry.
I think we're ready to move into your next. I think we're ready to move into your next portion if you'd like to, Stacy.
Okay. So, so the next thing I wanted to talk about is, do you guys have any resources? I know you touched on that in some of like resources, and I can link to them. Like, I'll post this on YouTube, and if you guys want to send me the resources that you discuss, I'll link to them on that video. And I also have a particular question, because I get asked it sometimes about BetterHelp and what's the other one? Talkspace. Are those accessible to blind people? And what are your opinions of them from a mental health perspective, if you know anything at all? Because
I don't know much about the accessibility of the apps or the software that is used for them personally, just because I've never used it as a provider or a client. I know my therapist, my supervisor last year, who was a therapist, when I was doing my final clinical rotation in school, she was using Talkspace as a side job. She was providing services through Talkspace as a side job, and her clients seem pretty satisfied. It is a very flexible option. I think my only qualm with it is that I've heard that they're limited in what insurance providers will take them. By no means is that a reason to not check them out and just find out. But that's been what a challenging thing is, that they're not really always covered by every insurance program. But yeah, from an accessibility standpoint, I'm sorry, I don't know much about that part.
And to people at home, these are apps. One is called Talkspace, and then the other one is called BetterHelp. I've never used either, but I have gotten asked this several times about if they're accessible.
But I know, the other option, if you really are looking for telehealth, which is totally understandable, like I was saying earlier, I would really recommend too, is just right now in the time of COVID, you just have to ask your therapist or, even if you don't have one yet, if you're looking for one and you start receiving services, I think right now, all it really takes is you saying, hey, I don't feel comfortable because of numbers, or I don't have access to transportation, or comfortable because of COVID numbers, or I don't have access to transportation, or whatever it might be. And pretty much everywhere I've seen is allowing people to do visits from home.
Awesome. So are there any other resources, I guess, that you guys would recommend and that we can link to below?
I love to recommend books, so I think it always depends on is that useful for people? But I definitely think there are certain books that can be really helpful, specifically for survivors. I recommend for specifically around working through on your own stuff around sexual trauma and sexual violence. And I can send you the list of them, so it's easier to link to them. But Healing Sex, as well as Pleasure Activism, which are both books that kind of help you kind of explore and figure out a safer place for yourself in healing that trauma. So those are some resources I recommend.
I know we talked about some hotlines earlier, so I really liked what was mentioned. It wasn't you, Jennith. I think it was Shafeka. I'm sorry. Yeah. You had mentioned some of the national sexual violence, domestic violence hotlines. I think those are great. And I also, to add to your list, I would really recommend NAMI, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. So even if, you don't think that you have a diagnosed mental health condition, that's completely fine. They have tons of resources that they can help you find somebody locally if you are looking for a therapist or looking for a support group. NAMI is a great resource to use. If you are in immediate crisis, I just really wanted to reiterate for anybody that might be watching this that is or knows somebody that is in immediate crisis right now. Of course, there's the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, and I can send the number to that. But then also I'll send you the number, Tracy or Stacy, to link in the video below. But I would also recommend the National Crisis Text Line. So it is a similar concept to what Shafeka had talked about with the teen dating violence text number. This is the same concept. Essentially, you are texting a person, but this isn't for any type of immediate crisis. A trained counselor will write back to you and help you just deal with the crisis at hand. Again, can offer you local resources, help you kind of work through anything that you might be an imminent or serious crisis right now. And their number is really easy. You just text 741-741, and they're a great resource. I used to volunteer as a counselor for them, and the staff there is phenomenal.
741-741. Good to know.
Yep. Yeah.
So, and again, I encourage you guys to send me any resources, and I will put them in the YouTube video, on the actual YouTube video. So people, if you're seeing this on social media, if you go to the actual YouTube site, I'll have them there. And so another question now is, we've talked about what survivors can do, but what can the blind community do to help survivors find justice, help survivors heal, or in their healing, and also to help prevent or to curb, to prevent and hopefully reduce, if not eliminate, these types of issues?
Yes, I think one of the biggest things, and this was actually touched on, and we'll see that so many of these themes really keep circling in. It was named, I think, by Aida earlier, that if there's a counselor there and you already have counseling as part of your plan, then it's much less stigmatizing. It's easier to come forward. Likewise, when we're talking about coming forward, you shouldn't have to be pouring through an organization's bylaws and their constitution and their whatever to find where to come forward to report something. It should be front and center, easy to access. You know, if XYZ happens, here's the support. It shouldn't be by like going through the website and finding like a code of conduct or, like I said, the bylaws. And this is really not just for blindness organizations. Like, you know, I'm in a very active political organization who's gotten slack for the same thing, where people are like, I have literally no idea how to report harassment or grievance issues. Because these things get buried down instead of like, oh, you know, support, you know, in case of harassment or if there are grievance issues that need resolving. So I think that's one of the first ways, because it then, in making someone have to comb through your documents to see what to report, it keeps that stigma real alive. Like, oh, you have to investigate how to do this. This is dirty work, you know, that kind of thing. So that's something that I think is super crucial. I think another big thing is that if we're serious about this, I apologize because I did name this earlier and I probably should have just waited until this question. But if we're serious about this, then it can't just be Joe Schmo affiliate president, Joe Schmo, like this guy, oh, this woman, oh, she teaches cooking in the agency. Yeah, she'll be the sexual assault like expert lady.
She's the one that
Sure.
everyone goes to for advice. So, I mean, she'll be great. You know?
Exactly.
At her, yep.
You know, we have to write grants. Like our rehab agencies write grants. Our, you know, nonprofits, our blindness agencies, they write grants. Write a grant for a sexual violence counselor, right? If you don't want it to be full-time, write it for a consultancy, write it for them to be there 10, 15 hours a week. Write it so that it's just contract money when it's actually, you know, when it ends up being needed. But put it in from the get-go instead of it being something that, oh no, there is crisis. What are we going to do? Plan ahead. It's the exact same advice that we are giving to employers, which is include accessibility from the get-go, and then you can hire disabled people. Include this knowledge from the get-go, and then you will be prepared when these things happen, which is beneficial to the organization and of course beneficial to survivors. And so that's one of the biggest things. The other things is getting rid of these like tribunal-esque processes. And instead, if that's devoting some time and research to you know, what would a transformative process look like in the blindness community? How could that work? How could we pilot it? And I think not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, because I think we can say for certain that in recreating the exact systems that are in other places, these like tribunal-esque things, those were bad. Those are really bad. They've gotten terrible feedback. They haven't worked.
Nope.
And so a different process is needed. But what we get in the real habit of is creating task forces and committees and things like that. And that's fine, that's good. I want there to be research. I want there to be opportunity for public comment. But we do that, and for the next 5 years, things stay the status quo. And so that also really isn't working. And in the meantime, the way you could really fix that is by like creating those counseling positions, even finding within your membership, maybe just stipending someone. I mean, the three of us are clearly experts in this field. I'm certain we aren't, you know, just complete rare unicorns. There's a few others, you know, stipend people for their time, but go to people who are doing this. And I think what I often see is that organizations aren't going to myself or Jennith, and instead they are relying on Joe Schmo affiliate president because he's a good guy.
Yeah.
And sometimes he's not such a good guy.
Precisely.
Like,
I really want to piggyback off of so much of what you said right now, Shafeka, because so much of it was so good. But I want to just first and foremost, I'm gonna call it what it is. The best thing we can do is just to stop sweeping it under the rug, because it clearly sounds like there is a pattern of. We wouldn't be here right now this evening talking about this if there wasn't a pattern of this happening over and over and over again. So, like, that is the most clear and obvious, and I would hope straightforward thing that we can do is just to stop ignoring it, stop sweeping
and
under the
if I
rug.
can say, because I have been asked this, why did you post those things on Facebook? And I'm clear, I'm not trying to burn something down. I just want to say publicly, sexual violence is a constant in the blind community. It is constant in our blind schools, in our guide dog schools, in our youth programs, in our summer camps, in our blindness rehabilitation centers, at our, conferences and conventions and events. It's really prevalent. In fact, I remember before I went to my first blindness event, someone told me that whenever a bunch of blind adults get together, their clothes come off, like everybody's clothes are coming off.
Wow.
And I was 18, and I was like, oh my God, that's mine aren't. Like, what kind of perverts are these people?
Right.
Like, oh my goodness. And now I'm like, I understand what he was trying to say. He's trying to say that, but so this exists. Don't tell us it doesn't. It exists.
Right.
So let's start from that place.
Right, exactly. That's like most basic fundamental thing that I want to say. And then piggybacking off of what Shafeka was saying about having the counselors. So there's definitely a prevailing thought in some schools of, that sounds redundant, a prevailing thought in some schools of thought, but in some philosophies, I should say, of blindness, that that blindness has historically been pathologized from a mental health perspective, and all disability has been historically pathologized from a mental health perspective. So in other words, pathologized just means that you are seeing a problem. So basically, in the past, blindness and other types of disabilities, it was always assumed by mental health providers like psychologists, psychiatrists, therapists, that people with disabilities were not well adjusted. They must have mental health problems, and it must be related to or because of their disability, right? We know that that is not true. We know that people with disabilities can be very well adjusted, regardless of whether they were born blind or even lost their vision or developed a disability later in life. Not everybody is going to be really depressed and really struggle. Some will, some won't. And if you have a mental health condition, it may or may not have anything to do with your disability. You could have depression because of chemical imbalances and other traumas in your life that has nothing to do with the fact that you are blind. However, there is a fear amongst some mental health or some blindness rehabilitation professionals, as well as blindness organizations, that if we include mental health providers as a core part of blindness training, rehab, conventions, organizations, etc., that we will be putting ourselves into a position where we will be pathologized once again. And that is a completely flawed school of thought or flawed rationale, because it isn't true. There is absolutely ways that we can still include therapists and counselors and provide mental health services for all individuals, whether it's in a training program or within an organization or in a state rehab agency program. That has nothing to do that for everybody to get mental health services, regardless of whether or not their mental health needs are related to their blindness or not. So I think that's something
frame it as ableism. So I was going to say, so maybe framing it as like ableism is a mental health concern, because ableism hurts our community, right? Or
right, absolutely. And I just think we need to disband this idea that if we include mental health as part of our organizations and our services, that automatically means that every blind person will be pathologized, because that is not the case. So I think that is a big barrier to why mental health has not been included as part of these organizations and services, because I've heard it directly from people in leadership in a lot of these organizations and in training centers. So that's a big issue that I think if we can get past that, that would be really helpful. And because then that counselor and that therapist can conduct screenings to see if there's abuse happening for individuals, you know, and not even have to conduct necessarily a specific screening, but, you know, use their clinical skills to decipher if something might be going on with the person. It's just one more professional pair of eyes, excuse me for the pun, but one more professional person there who can be one, act as a somebody who can to see if there's, to rule out or differentiate if there's abuse happening within the institution.
Yeah, and I think too, and maybe this has changed since I was in a training center, right? But like actively having conversations about what abuse looks like, and what those dynamics look like, right? Thinking about like what kind of sex education do a lot of blind folks get, right? Like how accessible is that sexual education, right? And so like kind of going back to this idea, like, you know, sometimes when we're abused or we're hurt, like we don't even know that's what happened. We know it didn't feel good. We knew it wasn't okay, but we don't always know that's what happened. And it can be years before we fully understand that. And so I think like also like training centers and other like places that support blind folks having information about like, this is abuse, like this is what abuse looks like. This is how like we understand it. It's really important to give people language to what is happening as well.
So maybe
I think that's especially important for everybody. I agree, Jennith, regardless whether it's within adult rehab training, but I think it's especially important in the youth programs. And I think kind of what Shafeka was saying about having a coordinator, like universities have Title IX coordinators for a reason. And a Title IX coordinator is basically somebody who is there to take complaints and check and be able to address any type of assault or harassment that happens or stalking that happens within a university. And so universities have those for a reason. Sorry guys, I'm still in like school mode. I keep saying we for school and I'm not in school anymore, but we all, universities have those coordinators for this exact reason, so that there is a well-trained professional designated person who handles this type of thing. And that is, I think, even more important. It's important for adults, but it's even more important for kids in these youth programs whose families are and their guardians are entrusting us to not only help, entrusting blindness organizations to not only help them gain independence, but also to keep them safe while they're doing it because they're still a minor.
I do want to.
So during this, during seminars at blindness training centers and youth programs, possibly having seminars, and often we know they happen daily or they happen several times a week, seminars on sex education, seminars on what is abuse, not just, hey, what are our expectations for your conduct, but look, guys, here's what grooming is. Hey, if this is happening, like, what is abuse?
And not even just, again, in the grooming, but also like what is abuse in relationships where people are on the same footing. Because there's those two types, again, where it's the teacher taking advantage of the student, but there's also just these relationships that are becoming abusive themselves. But I wanted to name a few things. I really appreciate, Jennith, that you said to give people the language and to name things, because I think it's so important that we just even name it. And that's part of not sweeping it under the rug, is not just naming it this time, but keeping it consistent and that language is always there. I wanted to, so yeah, I'm just very glad you had kind of said that. I couldn't agree more. I think another thing though is that when we're talking about kind of making our own systems and things that are different because other systems haven't been working for us, I do want us to be careful sometimes when we want to replicate like the Title IX system, because we also have to keep in mind things like HR, like human resources, things like Title IX are often not actually there to provide justice for the survivor. They're actually there to make sure that the place is following the law. And those are two different things. And so many times you'll end up actually finding a lot of experts are actually just their attorneys more than they are like sexual assault experts or survivor counselors or social workers or anything like that. And so I think what we really, really need in the disability community isn't another lawyer on staff, but is actually like a counselor, a social worker, someone who then is really creating the guidance for what needs to be done. And then the last thing I wanted to name is this isn't just a what should be done, but a what shouldn't be done, and what I've seen my entire life growing up in blindness organizations, is that in efforts to combat these issues, things just get penalized. And so it's boys and girls can't hang out together after 8 p.m.
Yeah.
In no other like setting, in like high school, in college, are like 16 to 23-year-olds not allowed to like fraternize with each other. You know, it's, oh, there is not allowed to ever be like alcohol. I totally understand, obviously, underage drinking, you can't condone that anywhere. But
well, often it's state property if it's a state rehab center.
Totally.
Yeah.
But like, you know, if we're talking about like, you know, like outings and things like that, or if we're even talking about, obviously, you know, alcohol is fine at conventions, it's private hotels, etc. But like, these are adults. In my adult work conferences, there are often drink tickets. There are often these things. Like, the infantilization that we talk about happening in ableism shouldn't also now become our norm for dealing with our community problems. And that happens so much, but especially with like teens and, you know, people ages like, let's say up to 25, where it's, you can't hang out with each other after X time. That is not teaching and helping people create healthy relationships. That is not curbing violence. Like, that is just creating another penal system. And that's,
I mean, you can't commit abuse before 8 p.m., right? Like,
exactly. And like, but then it's, if abuse does happen at 9 p.m., well, it's, Stacy, you weren't supposed to be with Tom at 9 p.m. anyway.
No,
you are
right.
equally bad, you know?
Sorry, Shafeka, to cut you off. I was just going to say, it also really, now that you're like saying this out loud, it's making me think, it's also really negating the fact that, first of all, it disregards people who are same sex, who are attracted
exactly,
to
because
yes,
God forbid,
I've heard
like,
a lot of that. Yes, I've heard a lot of that.
A woman abuse a woman, exactly.
Yes, I've gotten a lot of stuff about that.
Yep, and whether it's attraction or power, because we know that abuse doesn't happen most of the time because, you know, especially if it is that power differential, you know, a teacher versus a student or whatever, it isn't happening so much out of love and attraction, it's happening out of power, right? It's a form of power violence. And so we know that, you know, that completely negates those people, or people who are gender nonconforming. It totally disregards those types of situations where you're going to have abuse between, you know, the same gender victim and perpetrator.
Right. And so, yeah, I think just the biggest thing is making sure that what we're doing is following like a justice process, and not a process of more like penalizing where, oh, everyone is penalized. That's how we make it fair. And instead, it's not actually an empowering process to someone that does have something happen to them, that is being harassed, that does have, you know, a grievance or whatever it is to be filed. So I think like what this really, I just want to kind of summarize it for us, is not sweeping it under the rug, which includes naming it, which includes making it easily accessible on websites or on, you know, in schools and in the various centers where to go for these things. It includes like actually supporting survivors, as opposed to everyone is equally bad and everyone is equally guilty, and now this is how we do this. And you know, just like actively investing resources in people who can do these things, whether it's counselors, whether it's advocates, you know, whether it's just people who are sociologists who specialize in sexual assault or things like that. You know, it could go in a slew of different directions. and all of that is okay. And I think if we're going to talk about how organizations can be a part of healing, it's in actually being able to also apologize and say, we were told that, Frank Franklin was actually, that there has been a pattern with Frank Franklin, and we messed up. We did this wrong. We were part of these systems of silencing survivors. And actually, we are going to undo that. Like, it is never too late to start undoing a wrong. And I think people really fall into the habit of, it's okay, this person is emeritus now, they're a senior now, like, it's okay, it's okay. It is never too late to start undoing a harm. Like, that can actually start in this very moment.
And I really do like what you said earlier on the phone with me when you called it, you said it's basically a tribunal to find out if someone's lying. And that's really what it is. And I've heard, I don't remember if I've said this on this video or not, but one quote today that really stood out to me from someone was the ethics review process was actually more traumatizing than the event itself. And that summed it up, but I've heard that a lot, that like, okay, you're made and and I'm sure many organizations, but you're made to be in front of a panel of 4 people older than you a lot of the times, people who maybe are in a position of authority over you in some way or that you admire, but they certainly know you, they know your perpetrator, and you're, they're asking you questions. And I've heard that, sometimes the survivor is told, you cannot record this. Is anyone in the room with you? Meanwhile, they're recording it, or you can't have anyone in the room with you. Meanwhile, they're recording it. The survivor doesn't necessarily know who gets to hear that recording, when will it be destroyed. Often the process is not even outlined to the survivor. Like, here's what's going to happen. And people are surprised when they submit written accounts of what happened, that then their perpetrator gets to see it. And then when they say, oh my goodness, I can't believe my perpetrator just saw like everything I wrote, they'll be told like, that's the process. So, I mean, it's that whole court case aesthetic or ethos to that process is really traumatizing for people. Like like when people talk to me, they spend half their time talking about that.
Right. Right. And there's a reason that, especially in domestic violence, people go to advocates. Even the folks who work in the courthouses, often when people are doing protection orders and these things, are not attorneys. It's actually advocates. And that's because you do actually need to have a skill set in doing these things, not just in, oh, I loved watching Law and Order and I know all the questions to ask. And that is literally what happens.
Darn it. Because
I
would be good for that. Like,
I took a 90-minute training once a year and, I now can do this. It's crap. It's not true.
Right. And it just shows how clearly that process is in no way about a survivor, right? It's about protecting the institution. It has nothing to do with the survivor.
Precisely.
So changing the dynamic from protecting the institution, protecting the school, protecting the center, protecting the whatever, to keeping our members safe, keeping our students safe.
Right. And not thinking that keeping the members and students safe is protecting the institution versus protecting this idea of what the institution is itself.
Right. And people know, it's so funny because when I asked on Facebook for people to share me these stories, you would not believe the types of people that contacted me and are like, oh, this happened to one of our students. We sent one of our, students from the blind school to this camp or that camp and something happened. And I mean, it's like, everyone knows. Like,
the solution isn't
it
to
can only
fix it.
help.
The solution is, we don't go there anymore, or we don't do that anymore.
Yes, that
which is a problem because kids should go to camp. Kids should have these.
That is. Well, I guess the final question I wanted to ask is, how are you ladies? Do you have anything in the works or planning how to support victims or survivors? Excuse me.
Listen, like we've talked about this and I'm happy to go on record with this. this is not the first time I've tried doing this within the blindness community and felt very demoralized by it and the process that happened, and felt kicked out of like a process that I was someone who started, right? Or was like the very initial starters of. I'm happy to try and do it again. I think even years later now, I have, even more experience in being able to do it and being able to support folks. I want to be honest on what that capacity could look like. I'm not entirely sure. But for me, that would be a way that I'd be willing to, further contribute to disabled community. Whether it's just like kind of talking with folks one-on-one, not as like a permanent counselor or anything, but just, kind of being able to give help, give resources, or even just really in this broader way. I mean, I think what I'm genuinely best suited for is actually helping organizations build new processes, and act, if that's something they're actually trying to do. Because when this was tried in the past, what literally happened is we went with, popular man A, popular woman B, and, look what's happened. We're sitting here having this discussion. And that isn't because of lack of their efforts or their trying, but it wasn't just quite the right way to go about things. But, in kind of an interim, I'd be happy to help with like some groups and, gathering some folks to help them then organize themselves to run things independently. Yes. So yeah, that's where I'm kind of falling right now on this.
And I am aware of some survivors that are beginning to kind of put together survivor-led spaces, whether that will be private groups on Facebook, Zoom calls, so if you are a survivor and you want to be connected to other survivors who have experienced, abuse or violence of any kind in the blindness community, there are several survivor-led spaces that are being developed that I can point you to those who are working on them. So.
Yeah, I would actually love that, but I also I happy to be like resource for folks and like make sure people have resources. But it's really hard to be like to do therapy like right in this way. Like it's really best if folks can find folks locally but help like supporting people and finding those kinds of resources. Definitely can do. Yeah, and I think right like it is really the word's not exciting, right? Because exciting implies that like this is something we are like been. I don't know, right? We really want to have happened or like parts of it, but it's really empowering to see like survivors organizing in that way and like how do we support survivors to keep organizing in that way? Because that can be an exhausting process and there can be a lot of burning out. And right, and like there's a lot of conflict and that's just going to happen too, right? Just because you have experienced something doesn't mean you agree with others about like how you go about talking about that and figuring that out.
Right.
And we all have to take part of the load. I don't think we can have a leader in this movement to help survivors or to reduce the incidence of abuse within the community. I think we all have to do our part. Like if you have a blog, if you have a social media, whatever it is that your resources, if you have a listening ear, if you have a way of connecting people, I mean, we all have to do our part. But what we have to do is end the silence. I mean, that's got to stop.
All right, well, thank you, Stacy.
Well, thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
I am very, very grateful to you guys for coming. I'm grateful to Maida as well, who I think may be having some sort of connectivity issues. But
yeah.
I just want to thank you ladies so much for being willing to do this. It's not easy. So thank you very much. And I know that what you've done tonight is going to cause a world of good. I mean, I think what you've done is in some ways, I don't want to say monumental, but kind of monumental. I'm not sure that it's been done before. So.
Well, thanks, for providing this space and for, restirring the conversation, right? Causing good trouble.
Yeah. Restarting the fire.
Yeah. Someone's got to do it, Stacy. It's going to be you.
Or maybe you're just putting out the fire that's already been blazing forever.
Look, I didn't start the fire. It's always been burning.
Exactly.
It's been burning.
All right. Well, thank you, ladies.
All right. Good night.
Take care.
Good night.